Today we're going to be learning Yevamot daf Kuf Yud. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start at the bottom of Kuf Tet Amud Bet. So 3 lines from the bottom. We're going to ask now about Rav. Rav seemed to indicate that if a woman, again, we're talking about miyun, refusal. So she is only betrothed on a rabbinic level because her brother or her mother betrothed her. So now we're going to say that Rasava Rav says, at what point does she become married on a Torah level? So Rav says it's very clear when she has intercourse with him, when she's of age, then the nisuin turns into a Torah nisuin. Okay, it goes from the level of rabbinic to Torah level, which seems to imply, though, that without that, it's not like the day she becomes 12 and a half and doesn't refuse him, all of a sudden she's married to him. So Sevarav, Iba al-in, ilo ba'alo, right? Rav says, and this is actually asked the question, does he really hold that only if she engaged in intercourse with him, she's married to him on a Torah level, but if not, no? Itmar, isn't it stated that there's a debate between him and Shmuel about the following? You have a minor who didn't do miyun, and she got older, but she went and married somebody else. Now, if she's really married on a Torah level, she marries someone else, that's a case where we say, En Kiddushin Tofsim. There is no validity to that second marriage. So she wouldn't need a get. And what does Rav say here? Well, Rav Amar, Eina tzricha get misheni. Now, that would only be, though, if her marriage to the first one was on a Torah level. Because if her marriage isn't on a Torah level, then she is married to the second one. Because on a Torah level, she's not married to the first one at all. And then the second one would be a valid marriage. Shmuel Amar tzricha get misheni. Shmuel says she needs a get from the second. So Rav here doesn't really make sense because my lab de lo ba'al, we're assuming here, because it didn't say that she did, we're assuming Ktana Shalomi Yana Vigdila, she got older. She didn't end up having relations with her husband at all. The Amdavani Satan, she went and married someone else. It seems like her marriage is valid on a Torah level at that point as soon as she reaches the age of 12 and a half. So, it doesn't talk about age here, but we can assume once the window of miyun is closed, it must be the marriage is on a Torah level. And it doesn't sound like it requires bi'ilah, having intercourse. To which the Gemara says, lo, de ba'al. It didn't say that she had relations, but we have to assume she did. Then it fits perfectly with Rav. So then the Gemara says, well, I de ba'al, my tamid Shmuel. We kind of ignored Shmuel, but now we're going to say, okay, well, if they have relations, then why on earth would Shmuel say that the second marriage is valid? Of course, the second marriage is invalid. She's an Esharish. She's a married woman on a Torah level. So Kasaval, he holds a different approach. He says, she engages in intercourse with the second husband, with the first husband. She's just continuing on the basis of the original kiddushin. So basically, the original kiddushin was only Rabbanit. We're assuming she continues on that rabbinic level, even though she's doing an act of intercourse once she's of age. It's not like they said, oh, this one is going to be the one for marriage. No, they've been having intercourse throughout. They had intercourse when she happens to be older, but it's all on the basis of what had happened previously, which means that it stays on a rabbinic level. And therefore, the second marriage is actually valid because she's not even married to this person on a Torah level. So now the Gemara says, okay, so we've resolved Rav and we've explained that this machloket is actually once there actually was intercourse. And now they say, well, if that's the machloket Rav and Shmuel, they already had a debate about this some other time. To Itmar, as it was said, if she did the kiddushin upon condition and knasas stam, and then he marries her, okay, this is a different case. This has nothing to do with a minor. This is a person married, betrothed to a woman with a particular stipulation or condition, and the condition never took place. But then he went ahead and married her without making any reference to this condition. Rav Amar tzricha imenu get. Rav says that is a valid marriage. Why? We'll see in a minute. Shmuel, that was a bit of a teaser. Shmuel Amar, it wasn't a valid marriage at all. We're assuming, again, the condition was never met. Rav Amar, get. Why? Because he married her. He basically was saying, I don't really care about the condition. Yes, it's true, I betrothed you under condition, but now I'm willing to just go ahead with the marriage in any case. And that's why he doesn't even make mention of it. And that's why it's a valid marriage. Shmuel Amar, get. Why? Because kala bo'el adat kiddushin arishonim bo'el. When he did the be'ilav mitzvah, when he married her, they had intercourse. He was doing it upon condition that he had stipulated way back when. In other words, whatever he stipulated then is still true now. It's the exact same debate they're having by us. To which the Gemara says, why do you need both then? Well, the Gemara says, tzricha. If he just had the first one, you would have said in that case, Rav says, so why? Because there is a condition, okay? But as Rav says, yes, there's a condition, but basically by you overriding by you doing an act of marriage, you're basically saying, I'm doing an action and I don't care anymore about my original condition. But in the case of the minor, you might say, since there was no stipulation or condition, maybe he really is just continuing the marriage as it was before, and it's still rabbinic. And we're going to now take the same logic and say, well, then if you only had the case of here with the minor, you would say, that's when Shmuel says, because there was no stipulation, in that case, he says, it's clear he's just having this intercourse on the basis of the original Rabbanan rabbinic marriage. But in this case, but in our case, in the case of the stipulation, when there is actually a t'nai, a condition, maybe he really did mean maybe he did mean his action seems to be overriding the condition. Okay. So you might say that Shmuel agreed with Rav in that case, and that's why you need both cases. Now we're going to ask again the same question we started with, but from a different source. So we started to ask, does Rav really hold that Be'ilah is necessary? Here it seems like Be'ilah is not necessary and the marriage is going to become a Torah level marriage. In any case, from using that source that we saw where he said she doesn't need to get from the second one, the marriage clearly turned to Doraita without intercourse. And then they said, no, that case there was intercourse. So now we're going to have the same type of question, and one of the answers is going to be a similar type answer. But instead of coming from an opinion he has about something else, we're going to quote it from a case that happened with one of his students. Did he really say it all depends on, right? Having intercourse is what's going to change the status of this woman to a Torah level marriage. There was a case, it happened in the city of Narash. He betrothed her when she was young, and she got older. He put her on the apirion that we saw 2 days ago, that Shuli Mishna wrote about this week. He put her on that chair meant for the bride, which is usually meant for someone before the marriage. Comes along another man, grabs her up, and goes and betroths her while she's about to be married to some other man. You have to assume that she agreed, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. You have to have agreement. But anyway, we're not going to get into that. So 2 students of Rav were there. That's why this is important about Rav. They said she's not really married to the second, or betrothed to the second guy. She doesn't need a get. So why? So in other words, theoretically, she clearly didn't have relations yet with the first guy because it was right before their wedding, and the other guy snatches her up. So it would seem that without Be'ilah, she's still married on a Torah level to the first guy because she'd already came of age, right? So her coming of age seems to be what does it, not having relations with him. So that made her marriage with him on a Torah level, which means she's not even married to the second guy. So now we're going to have 2 answers. Amar Papa. Just like we thought the first case was in the case where there wasn't intercourse yet. This case also, we thought there wasn't. Turns out it was. In Narash, it seems, at least they're suggesting, that maybe they put the bride on the chair at the end of the ceremony, after she was already married to him and after she engaged in relations with him. And then the case would be exactly right. Oh, because they engaged in relations, that's why it's on a Torah level. That's why she doesn't need to get from the second guy. But Rav Ashi Amar, and his answer is much more interesting, although the first one's interesting in and of itself, right? Different customs, and you're trying to learn from something based on what you know the custom to be by you, but maybe their custom is different than yours. Rav Ashi says, and this is similar to the camel rider we had a few days ago, he acted inappropriately, and therefore we treat him inappropriately. Here comes you're ready for the big line? The second one was a fair and square legitimate marriage, betrothal. Okay, meaning from a halachic perspective, she wasn't married to the first guy on a Torah level, and therefore, because there was no intercourse, that fits with Rav, and therefore she could theoretically be married to the second guy, but come the rabbis and they say, you did something totally inappropriate by grabbing this woman who was about to get married to somebody else, snatching her away. Well, we're going to treat you and we're going to use our power as the court and punish you. And we're basically going to annul your marriage. Okay, this is fascinating from many different perspectives. First of all, you see the rabbis have the power to annul marriages. And this is why people say, why don't we do that in get cases, right? When someone can't get a get, so why don't you just annul the marriage? Very difficult to do this in halacha. And one of the reasons is our sugya. Because one of the things that the commentaries talk about, they look at the few sugyas. There's only a few sugyas where they use this. One of them is in Gitim, we're going to get to about bitul get, someone who cancels a get, and against this takana of Rabban Gamliel, who didn't allow it to be canceled, and they did it in a way that Rabban Gamliel forbade. And there the rabbis say, because he did that, we're allowed to come in and annul the marriage. And both those cases have a certain similarity, which is what? In each case, the man acted inappropriately. And then come the rabbis and they say, listen, Kiddushin is done Kedat Moshe Yisrael, according to our laws. If you don't keep our laws, we can uproot your Kiddushin. So, and it shows again the power of the courts. We had all those sugyot about the power of the courts. Here again, you get into the power of the courts. So now they say, Amalei Ravina le Rav Ashi, Tina te Kaddish bekaspa. I understand if you betroth her with money, how this works. Because rabbis always have the power to move money from one person to another. It's one of the powers of the courts. You could say it's called hefker beit din hefker. We can move money from one person to another. They have power to do that. So they can basically say, you gave her this money, this ring, to betroth her. We're going to claim that's a gift. And it has nothing to do with marriage. But kaddish b'biyamai, but if you have relations with her, intercourse, to betroth her, what can they do with that? They can't undo that action, change it. Well, Shiur Rabbanan lebilato bilatznu. They basically say that was an intercourse of znut. Okay, so they can change what type of action of intercourse it was. Can't change the action happened, but they could change the nature of it. And with that, they can uproot Kiddushin. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, now back to the Mishna, dealing with this past Mishna. Halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer, v'chein amar Rabbi Elazar, halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, what did Rabbi Eliezer say? That if you have these two sisters, one was a ketana, and then the other one fell to yibum, to the sister, to the sister's husband. So Rabbi Eliezer, it's dim aktana lema'em, we teach her to do miyun, and then the gdola can do yibum. Okay, so we basically encourage the younger one to do miyun so that the older sister can go, the one who's of age already, can go and do the mitzvah of yibum. Okay, and that was how we got, right, from this machloket and Rabban Gamliel's opinion, that's how we got to Rav. Okay, new Mishna. He was married to two minors, and Yetomot, which means the father wasn't alive. So again, it was all a marriage to Rabbanan, and then he dies. Okay, we've learned this all along. Two wives, one does the chalitza or the yibum, and the other one is exempt. Same thing here, but we'll see where it doesn't exactly work. Same thing if they're both deaf. Okay, deaf we mean deaf mute. Okay, right? They might be of age, but they're deaf mutes. In which case, again, their marriage is only rabbinic, and then they can either, again, one of them exempts the other. We're assuming right now it's referring to everything said before, which means either yibum or chalitza. The Gemara is going to immediately ask, but wait, you can't do chalitza with a deaf woman. Remember, a deaf mute can't do chalitza because they can't speak and say the words. Talked about that, so that's going to be a big question of the Gemara. If you have a minor and a deaf woman who are married, if you do on one of them, yibum, right? Let's just assume yibum, right? That's what they're talking about. It doesn't exempt the other. Okay, we're going to have to see why in the Gemara. Pikachat, that'll be at the end of today's stuff. Pikachat, bechereshet, if you have a pikachat, one who's of sound mind, and in a normal, and a chereshet, someone who's a deaf mute, okay, the one who can hear and can speak exempts the chereshet. Okay, because again, her marriage is on a Torah level, and the other's marriage is only on a rabbinical. But the chereshet can't exempt the pikachat, right? Why is that? Because her marriage is only to Rabbanan, so her chiyuv of yibum, her obligation of yibum is only rabbinic. So she can't exempt the pikachat who has a doraita, a Torah obligation of yibum. Gdola uktana, if you have an older woman and a younger woman, bi'at hagdola poteret haktana. Okay, the relations with the older one will exempt the younger one, but ein bi'at tana poteret hagdola. Again, as soon as you mix rabbinic and Torah, it's not going to work anymore. So now comes the Gemara and starts asking questions. This is going to be a big question. Chereshet is really can do chalitza? Ba'atznan, doesn't it say in the Mishna? We learned this on Daf Kuf Daled. Cheresh shenichlatz v'chereshet shechatza v'choletzet min hakatan chalitzata psula. A cheresh and a chereshet can't do chalitza. So what are you talking about? So Amarav Gidol Amarav Abiyah. Here's the best answer. He says, listen, it said if you were married to two yatomot, ktanot, and then they die, biyatar chalitzata, don't exempt the other. Okay? And biya and chalitza are both options. When they mentioned or the same thing for shtei chashot, they meant the same thing regarding if you do yibum to them, but not if you do chalitza because they can't do chalitza. But Raba doesn't accept this answer. And Raba, it says Raba, but it really means Raba here. Raba says, afilu tema chalitza, kam b'chereshem ikara, kam b'pikachat v'achar kach nitcharsha. He makes a distinction between two types of deaf women, deaf mutes. One who is like that when she first got married, which means her marriage is only rabbinic, in which case getting out of her marriage or getting out of the yibum, right, the chalitza, is only rabbinic. In that case, in a minute, we're going to see, he allows it because we'll see the same way she goes in, that's how she can go out. But with someone who was a pikachah when she got married, she wasn't a deaf mute when she got married, and then she became a deaf mute. Well, her marriage is on a Torah level, and now her chiyuv yibum is on a Torah level, but she's only able to do things, and she can't do things the way she could then because she's a deaf mute. And then she can't do the chalitza. So that's Rabba's unique shita. So here, let's read. If she was deaf from the beginning, the same way she went out, that's how the same way she went in, that's how she goes out. In other words, the commentators say birimiza, right? She gestures, she uses gestures, and that's how we can do chalitza with her. But she's the one who needs to be able to recite. And since she could have recited when she got married, but she can't now, we're not going to let her get out of it with chalitza. So this, by the way, puts that whole Mishna we learned in a different light, because it's not all deaf mutes who can't do chalitza. It's only deaf mutes who were fine when they got married and then became deaf mutes later. So Abai now comes and brings a question. And now we're going to start off with quoting a lot of Mishnayot that are kind of crazy Mishnayot that all come up on Daf Kuf Yud Bet, and we're going to learn through them now. We're going to learn them again when we get to Daf Kuf Yud Bet. So Abai comes and now starts asking questions, and he says, "Wait a minute. You want to say Cheresha Mikara can do Cheresha from the right from when she was married can do chalitza? That's none. It says in the Mishna. So we have one who's competent, one who's a deaf mute, the brothers. They're married to two different women. One is competent, one is a deaf mute. Okay, so now so the competent's married to the competent, the deaf mute is married to the deaf mute. If the deaf mute brother dies with no children, so what does the competent husband do with the deaf mute Yevamot? Kones, he can only do yibum with her. He can't do anything, right? He can't do chalitza. Here we're going to see. If he wants to divorce her after that, he can divorce her. Okay? He's permitted to divorce her once he does yibum with her. But if the competent one dies, okay, what can the deaf mute brother do? Kones, he can marry the competent woman, the wife. He can do yibum with her. He can't do chalitza because the deaf mute can't do chalitza. But now he's prohibited from divorcing her. Why is he prohibited from divorcing her? Because she is competent, but he's a deaf mute. A deaf mute can't do a divorce to a woman who's obligated on her. He can only do a divorce that has rabbinic validity. Now, her marriage to him is a chiyuv yibum on a Torah level because she was married to a competent man. He died. She felt yibum to his brother. So their marriage is deoraita, is Torah, but his capabilities are only rabbinic in terms of divorcing her. So he can actually never divorce her. So now, what's the point of this case before we get to the next one? We say here, we're assuming that we're talking about the first case where she was a deaf mute. She must have been a deaf mute from the beginning, right? And what did we say about her? Remember, she can only do yibum. That's this picture. She can't do chalitza. So the katani kones in, it says she can only do yibum, turning out on the bed. Choletz lo, but she can't do chalitza. So here you see a deaf mute from birth, or not, we don't care if it's from birth, but from the time she got married, can't do chalitza. And that goes against what Raba said. So the Gemara says, well, why are you assuming that's what it is? It could be maybe she was competent when she got married to the deaf mute. And only later did she become a deaf mute. So you can't prove it from here. Next case, Tashma. Head to the presentation. Okay. Okay, this Mishna is, the reason I said the Mishna is crazy is because it gives 1,000 different permutations. Two brothers who were competent. So they're each married to two women. One is competent, one is a deaf mute. Okay, so now, the one who's married to the deaf woman dies. Again, what can the competent brother do with the deaf mute? Kones, he marries her. Again, he can only do yibum with her. He can't do chalitza because she can't do chalitza. If he wants to divorce her after that, he's allowed to divorce her because he has the competence to divorce the deaf mute woman. Remember, she doesn't have to agree to the divorce, so the fact that she's a deaf mute is not a relevant point. If the pikach dies, so let's go back to the beginning. So two competents married to a competent deaf mute. The competent brother married to the competent woman dies. What can the competent brother do with the competent wife? Chalitza he could do chalitza or yibum because she could do chalitza or yibum, and he's competent, so he could do chalitza or yibum. Now, the point though of this story is the first part, where again we said the deaf mute wife can only do yibum. So again, we're going to say my love midehu pikach miikara hinami cheresha miikara. Now we're assuming he's competent. He must have been competent at the time of the marriage as well. So therefore, if he's competent from the beginning, and the opposite is the deaf mute, it must be she was deaf mute from the beginning. Meikara, right? Vekatane, and what does it say? Kones in choletz lo. It said she can only do yibum, but she can't do chalitza. So again, we get back to here. You seem to see against Raba, a woman who is a deaf mute from the beginning can't do chalitza. So the Gemara says, how do we assume this? Because we said the competent brother was competent from the beginning, and therefore the deaf mute must be deaf mute from the beginning. To which they say, you don't necessarily need to say that. He could have been competent from the beginning, but she could have been a deaf mute only from while she was married. Okay, third question. Shnei achim, two brothers. One is a deaf mute and one is competent. Now, here comes the story changes a little. They're married to two sisters. So the competent married to the competent, the deaf mute married to the deaf mute. So the deaf mute dies, who's married to the deaf mute. He's married on a Torah level to her sister. So she's exempt from yibum entirely because he's married to her sister. We can't do that. But if the competent one dies, what does the deaf mute do with the competent wife? Well, now we have an issue. The deaf mute and the deaf mute are married to each other only on a rabbinic level. And now there's an obligation of yibum on a Torah level of this competent woman. So, the deaf mute woman needs a get because right now, this is what we call achotz kukato, if you remember this. He now has zika, right? He has an obligation of yibum to her sister. Now, when you have an obligation of yibum to a woman, you're not allowed to be married to their sister, unless you're married to the sister, which is totally legitimate, and then the other one would be exempt. But in this case, he's married to the deaf mute and only rabbinic. So on a Torah level, he's got this zika to the competent woman. So he must divorce his deaf mute wife. But since now he gives her a get, so even though their marriage wasn't rabbinic, now she has a get. Once she has a get from him, we learned before many times that when you get a get from a man, right, usually it's because you're married to him, but even if you were married to him, it gives you a get that prevents you from marrying all his relatives. So now he can't marry her sister, so he's prohibited to her forever. Okay. So what's the point of this story? Well, they now say, if you want to say that he was a pikach and then became deaf, this deaf mute husband that's supposed to now, stuck with these two women, Mimasemapik. Remember what happens in the story. He gives his first wife a divorce. Now, if he was a pikach in the beginning, he was competent when he married her, that would be a marriage on a Torah level. Now he's a deaf mute. He can only give a weaker gerushin, a weaker divorce. That won't be enough to get rid of to divorce her. So, right, the hatnan, and now we're going to read this inside. Nitcharsha. First, we're going to go through what if it happens to her, and then we'll get to what we need for our purposes, which is what if it happens to him. If she becomes deaf once she was already married, yotzi. He can divorce her because it doesn't matter. Because again, by Torah law, you don't need the woman's consent. Takanat Rabbeinu Gershom already instituted women need to have consent to get, but in those days they didn't. Nishtatet, if she goes crazy, okay, she loses her mind, lo yotzi. This is a fascinating halacha. This is just, he can't ever divorce her. Why? They don't want people like that on the street because they're worried that people will take advantage of them. It's a known thing, right? The people who aren't as in control of themselves may be taken advantage by other people. And because of that, he's not allowed to divorce her. Nitchereshu onishtate. Now here's the part we're looking for. If he became divorced or he became not of sound mind, lo yotzi olamit, he can never divorce her because the marriage was done on the Torah level and the get is only on a rabbinic level, so he can't ever divorce her. So therefore, it must be because he gives her a get that he must have been a deaf mute from the beginning. Now, since he was a deaf mute from the beginning, she must be a deaf mute from the beginning, in which case, if not only that, okay, now, we don't really have an issue here because there was no chalitza here, but now, this case was two sisters, but it was compared before to the case where they weren't sisters. So we're going to assume that if one factor changed from the case before to this case, but only one factor, we're not changing two factors. So in that case, since these achayot chersho were meikara, therefore nochuyot nami chersho meikara. Since the sister cases, they must have been deaf from the woman who was deaf must have been a deaf mute from the beginning. Likewise, the case before where they weren't sisters, she must have been a deaf mute from the beginning. And in that case, she doesn't do chalitza. You have to go all the way back to the case before. But we've now proven that you can't do chalitza even if you were a deaf mute from the beginning. So that really goes against Raba, and there's not so much more to say. So therefore, we're going to see, sorry, I lost my place for a second. Ishtik. Okay, so we first I skipped the line. Utnan gabe nochriyot, and it says by nochriyot kones in choletz lo. It says specifically only, right? Marrying them, you can do yibum with the woman, but you can't do chalitza. Ishtik, Raba was silent; he didn't know what to answer. Ki answer the kamei Rav Yosef. When they came before Rav Yosef said to them, "Amalei, my time at Tot Meha. Why were you questioning him from there? I have an answer for all this. I could have explained to you. You could have just said, yeah, they changed a few facts. Number one, it was sisters and not people who weren't related to each other. Number two, this case is they were deaf from the beginning, and the previous case was they weren't deaf from the beginning, and with that you can resolve. But if you wanted to ask a question, you could do it from here, from the next case. Okay, what's the next case? Shnei achim chershim. Nisuin, okay, again, we're back to the Mishnah on Kuf Yud Bet. Two deaf brothers, deaf mutes, nisuin shte achayot pikchot. Okay, they're married to two competent women. Or, and I'm not going to go through all these cases, okay, or shte achayot chershot. Okay, the main thing is the two brothers are deaf, and they're married either to two competent women or two deaf women, or shte achayot chapikacha bechad cheresh, one competent, one deaf, or similar case, ken shte achayot chershot. Okay, what you have here is minimum, both either the men or both the females are deaf. Okay, okay, again, two deaf sisters, and the men could be any sort of combination. Okay, let's see the case. So, if the deaf mute, let's just say if the case with two brothers are deaf mutes, one of them dies. So both of them, okay, okay, his wife is now exempt from chalitza or yibum. Why? Because their marriage, both marriages were only rabbinic. That's because no matter what, one of the people was deaf mute. So because of that, their marriage was only rabbinic, in which case, when she falls to yibum to the other brother, he's married to her sister on a rabbinic level, and everything's rabbinic. The arayot is, right, it's maybe he's married to her sister. Anyway, they're exempt no matter what. There's no chiyuv yibum. Okay, we'll get into this when we get to the Mishna. But the point here being, again, one second. So now we go on a little bit more. V'im hayu nochriot, if the two wives were not sisters, yichnosu. Then when the deaf mute dies, the other deaf mute brother can do yibum with the competent sister. Notice he does yibum with her. He can't do chalitza. V'im ratzu lotzi yotzi. And if he wants to divorce her, he can divorce her. Now, what's the idea here? Hechidami, what's the case? If the deaf people discussed here were originally of sound mind and then became deaf, right, or whatever, they weren't deaf at all, and then they became deaf mutes. So are they allowed to divorce? No. We learned they can't divorce. And what did we say here? Right? He can divorce her, right? He's permitted to divorce her if he wants. So, but he wouldn't be able to divorce her again if when the marriage took place, he was totally fine, because then his marriage was Torah level, his divorce is rabbinic, that can't undo a Torah level marriage. So they say, okay, so it must be the men discussed here are deaf from the beginning. We're going to assume if the deaf mutes discussed in this Mishna of the men they were deaf from the beginning, deaf mutes from the beginning. Then with the women, it must be they were also deaf mutes from the beginning. And again, it says there, she can't do chalitza. Right? Which means they can only marry her, but what can't they do? They can't do chalitza. So what do you see here? A deaf mute from the beginning can't do chalitza, not the woman, not the man, and tiyuvta de Raba tiyuvta. That, in fact, is a question on Raba that we don't really have an answer for. Okay, going back to the Mishna, right? This whole section was really just an entire amud just on questions on Raba. And that one thing the Raba said, that a deaf mute, if you were deaf mute at the beginning when you were first married and then you fall to yibum, you can do chalitza, and basically this is rejected. Okay, the Mishnah said, if the ketana and chereshet are married, and their husband dies, doesn't exempt their tzara. So now the Gemara wants to explain this. I'm Rav Nachman. Eshkach tele Rav Ada bar Ava ulu Rav Chana Chatna to Yatve v'kamakavu akvata b'shuka de pumbedita. They were sitting possibly with their students all around, or they were sitting answering questions. There's different interpretations brought to what the statement means. But basically, they were in the shuk of pumbedita and they were saying the following. Haditznang tana v'cheresh ein bi'atachat mehem poteret tzarata. It's when they fall to yibum with a brother who's a pikach, who's of knowledge. Because they don't know. Now, this is fascinating. Until now, we've always assumed yibum can be done with either one of the women. But now we're going to learn that when it's clear and there's a clear difference between them, perhaps the original husband preferred one to the other. And if you prefer one to the other, then the yibum has to be with the one he preferred more than the other. Similar to like the Ketana and the Gdolah, but it's different a little bit, but somehow this seems to be a factor. So now, what's the problem? If it must be that they fell from Achid Pikach, and that's why we say one doesn't exempt the other, because why? We don't know which one he preferred more. Maybe he liked better because she'll eventually become a grown woman. But maybe, right, whereas the chereshet is a deaf mute now, she'll be forever probably a deaf mute. Whereas the ktana will outgrow her, her weakness, which is that she's a minor now. But if it's the chereshet who has that weakness, nicha maybe though, but she's got an advantage over the ktana that right now she's a gdolah, she's already mature, and ubat biai, and she can have intercourse with him. Now, he can also have intercourse with the younger woman, and I don't think it's a matter of how much pleasurable the intercourse is. I think it's an issue of she can have children. She's of childbearing age, and that's better for him. So we don't know which he preferred, because each one has a pro and a con. But therefore, it must be it's the pikach. But if it was a deaf mute brother who was married to this deaf mute woman and a minor, it would be obvious which one he prefers. But right? Deaf people often like being in the vicinity of other deaf people, right? It's their comfort zone. They can communicate much better with them. So maybe prefers to be in the community of the deafened, that woman must be more preferable. And now it's really because she's got two things going for her. Number one, she's mature already, and bat minei, and she's the same type as him. So Amina lahu ana. Now that was the discussion they were having, but he says, but after I heard that discussion, I said to them, I think even if he was deaf, it wouldn't be clear which he would prefer, and therefore there would be this question. Okay, we're going to stop here and figure out. We're going to get into that. So how do you resolve this situation if with these women? Okay, we'll get to that in tomorrow's class. We'll start from the bottom of today's daf. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.